Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Before we start today's case, I want to ask for your support by subscribing to my channel. Your support is very important to me, so please subscribe to follow more cases and encourage us. Click the like button and let's get into the case. The morning fog clung to the California coastline like a damp shroud, obscuring the boundary between sea and sky. Thomas Reeves pulled his wetsuit up over his torso, the neoprene material clinging to his skin as he zipped it closed. At 42, he'd spent more than half his life exploring the waters along the Pacific coast. First as a curious teenager with a borrowed mask and fins, then as a marine biology student at UC Santa Cruz, and now as an established underwater photographer whose work had been featured in National Geographic and Ocean Conservancy publications. The small cove just south of Monterey Bay was a favorite spot of his, relatively unknown to tourists and casual divers. Today he planned to photograph the dense kelp forests that swayed beneath the surface like an undulating underwater jungle. Local marine researchers had reported increased activity in the ecosystem recently, with several sea lion colonies establishing themselves in the area, which in turn had drawn other marine life. It was early October, prime season for great white sharks along the central California coast as they migrated through the region. Thomas checked his equipment one last time. Unlike scuba diving, free diving required minimal gear: mask, snorkel, fins, and his waterproof camera housing. The simplicity was what had drawn him to the sport in the first place. No tanks, no regulators, no complicated breathing apparatus, just a man and his trained lungs exploring the ocean depths on a single breath. After 15 years of practice, Thomas could hold his breath for over 4 minutes and reach depths approaching 100 feet. "Looking good out there today," remarked Sarah Chen, a park ranger who occasionally patrolled this stretch of shoreline. She stood at the edge of the parking lot, clipboard in hand, documenting visitor activity as part of the Marine Sanctuary's monitoring program. "Morning, Sarah," Thomas called back, adjusting his weight belt. "Any reports I should know about?" "Nothing specific," she replied, walking over, though some fishermen spotted a couple of sea lions with bite marks yesterday, about a mile north. "Probably shark activity, but that's normal for this time of year." Thomas nodded. "Nature doing its thing, I'll keep my eyes open." Sarah's expression grew serious. "You going out alone again?" "Just for a couple of hours. I'll stay within the kelp beds. Nothing crazy." "You know the recommendation is always to dive with a buddy," she reminded him, though she'd given up trying to enforce the guideline with Thomas years ago. His solo diving habits were well established, and his experience made him as safe as anyone could be in the unpredictable ocean. "I'll check in when I get back," Thomas promised, a routine they'd established over the years. He slipped his waterproof watch onto his wrist, 7:15 a.m. "Expect me by 10, 11 at the latest." Sarah made a note on her clipboard. "I'll be here until noon. After that, the afternoon shift takes over." Thomas grabbed his small waterproof bag containing his phone, car keys, and wallet, and stashed it in the secure box attached to his vehicle. The October morning air was crisp against his exposed face as he walked down the rocky path to the small beach. The fog was beginning to burn off, sunlight filtering through in hazy beams that danced across the water's surface. He waded into the shallows, the cold Pacific water seeping into his wetsuit. California waters never truly warmed, even in summer, hovering between 50 and 60 degrees Fahrenheit. His 5mm wetsuit would keep him comfortable enough during the planned 2-hour session. Thomas spat into his mask, rubbed the saliva around the inside of the lens to prevent fogging, then rinsed it in the seawater before securing it to his face. He slipped his fins onto his feet, adjusted his snorkel, and began swimming toward the deeper water where the kelp forest thrived. The transition from land dweller to water creature was always magical for Thomas. Each stroke carried him further, from shore, further from the world of noise and concrete and digital screens. Out here there was only the rhythm of his breathing through the snorkel, the soft resistance of the water against his body, and the gradually changing seascape beneath him. About 300 yards from shore, the underwater terrain began to transform. What had been mostly sandy bottom, with occasional rocky outcroppings, gave way to a vibrant underwater forest. Thick stalks of bull kelp anchored to the seafloor rose toward the surface, their elongated air bladders keeping the 20-foot-plus fronds buoyant in the gentle current. Schools of brightly colored Garibaldi damselfish darted among the kelp, while larger calico bass hovered in the shadows. This was Thomas's element, this underwater world that few people ever truly experienced. He spent the first 45 minutes on the surface, snorkeling around the perimeter of the kelp forest, scouting locations and taking some preliminary photos. The visibility was excellent today, at least 60 feet, allowing him to see deep into the kelp structure. A few harbor seals eyed him curiously from a distance, their sleek bodies twisting effortlessly through the water. Thomas checked his watch, 8:05 a.m. Time to begin the real work. He secured the camera strap around his wrist, took several deep breaths to prepare his lungs, then bent at the waist and kicked downward, his body slicing through the surface into the depths below. The first descent was always a calibration, a reacquaintance with the pressure and sensation of depth. Thomas equalized his ears every few feet, pinching his nose through his mask and gently blowing to balance the pressure in his middle ears with the increasing water pressure outside. At 30 feet, he hovered briefly, feeling the embrace of the water column, the pleasant squeeze of the ocean against his wetsuit. His heart rate had automatically slowed, part of the mammalian dive reflex that conserved oxygen during submersion. He snapped a few test shots, checking the camera settings, then kicked back to the surface to breathe. After a brief recovery, he descended again, this time aiming for a patch of particularly dense kelp where the morning sunlight created dappled patterns through the swaying fronds. At 50 feet, Thomas found the perfect composition, a natural archway formed by two massive kelp stalks, with a school of blue rockfish swimming lazily through the opening. He positioned himself, adjusting his buoyancy with subtle movements of his hands, and began capturing images. Photography required absolute focus, a meditative state where Thomas became one with his surroundings, anticipating movements, waiting for the perfect alignment of light and subject. He was so absorbed in his work that he almost missed the subtle change in the water, a slight shift in pressure, an almost imperceptible vibration that traveled through the liquid medium. The fish noticed it first, the school suddenly dispersing, darting into the protective cover of the kelp. Thomas's primal instincts activated before his conscious mind could process what was happening. Something had changed in the environment, something significant enough to alter the behavior of the marine life around him. He tucked his camera close to his body and rotated slowly, scanning the blue-green space around him. Nothing. His lungs were beginning to signal their need for air, the first gentle urges to return to the surface. He had perhaps another 30 seconds of comfortable breath-holding before the urges would become demands. Thomas began a controlled ascent, maintaining awareness of his surroundings as he kicked toward the surface 30 feet above. That's when he saw it, a massive shadow moving deliberately along the outer edge of the kelp forest. The silhouette was unmistakable, a great white shark, its torpedo-shaped body at least 15 feet long, moving with the fluid grace that had evolved over millions of years of oceanic supremacy. Thomas froze momentarily, his training warring with instinct. The freediver's handbook was explicit about encounters with large predators. Maintain visual contact, move slowly and deliberately, avoid erratic movements that might trigger a predatory response. But the human brain's survival circuits were equally insistent. Get out, get away, get to safety. He chose a middle path, continuing his ascent but at a measured pace, eyes fixed on the shark that appeared to be patrolling the perimeter of the kelp forest. The great white hadn't appeared to notice him yet, its attention seemingly focused on something beyond Thomas's field of vision, perhaps a seal colony or school of fish. 20 feet from the surface, Thomas allowed himself to believe he might complete the ascent without incident. The shark remained at the same depth, moving parallel to the kelp line, showing no interest in the human observer. 10 feet from the surface, Thomas began to relax marginally, already planning his exit strategy, a calm but direct swim to shore, maintaining awareness without panicking. 5 feet from the surface, everything changed. The shark's behavior transformed in an instant, its casual patrol suddenly becoming a focused approach. It banked sharply, its pectoral fins adjusting its course directly toward Thomas. There was a terrible intelligence in that movement, a calculation that had been refined through countless predatory encounters. Thomas broke the surface with a desperate gasp, gulping air into his oxygen-starved lungs while simultaneously trying to locate the shoreline. The momentary disorientation of transitioning from underwater to surface vision cost him precious seconds. When he re-established his bearings, the shore seemed impossibly distant, at least 200 yards away. He made a split-second decision to head for the thickest part of the kelp forest rather than attempting to outswim the approaching predator to shore. Great whites typically avoided the tangled kelp structures, their massive bodies not suited for navigating the dense vegetation. Thomas took 3 powerful breaststrokes toward the kelp, then dove beneath the surface to check the shark's position. The decision to look back nearly stopped his heart. The great white had accelerated, its muscular tail propelling it through the water with frightening speed. It was no longer patrolling but hunting, and Thomas was directly in its path. He estimated he had seconds, not minutes, before the shark would be upon him. With desperate energy, Thomas kicked hard, driving himself toward the protective kelp forest. He could feel the pressure wave preceding the shark, the displacement of water caused by its massive body closing the distance. The thick stalks of kelp were just ahead, reaching toward him like lifelines. His fingers grasped the first strands of kelp, and he pulled himself forward with all his strength, trying to interpose the natural barrier between himself and the charging predator. The water around him suddenly churned as the shark entered the edge of the kelp forest, its powerful body thrashing against the vegetation that impeded its movement. For a moment, Thomas believed the kelp might protect him, might convince the shark to abandon the chase in favor of easier prey. That hope evaporated when he felt the sudden rush of water as the great white pushed through the kelp barrier, driven by hunting instinct and the tantalizing proximity of prey. Time compressed into a series of sensory snapshots, the dark shape materializing below him, the cavernous mouth opening to reveal rows of serrated teeth, the surprisingly small black eye rolling back in its protective sheath as the shark prepared to strike. Thomas kicked upward in desperation, trying to use the shark's momentum against it to position himself above its attack path. He almost succeeded. The initial strike caught the trailing edge of his left fin, the shark's teeth shearing through the rubber material like paper. The force of the near miss spun Thomas in the water, disorienting him momentarily. The shark, missing its primary target, circled back with startling agility for such a large animal. Thomas kicked toward the surface, knowing he needed air, knowing also that the surface created a silhouette that made him especially vulnerable. He broke through into daylight, gasping for breath, immediately searching for options. The kelp forest extended another 50 yards to his right, offering denser cover than his current position. He began swimming forcefully toward the thicker kelp, no longer concerned with calm movements, focused solely on reaching relative safety. 3 strokes in, he felt the water surge beneath him. Acting on pure instinct, Thomas dove, driving himself downward just as the shark breached where he had been a second earlier, its massive body clearing the water in a spectacular display of power before crashing back into the ocean in a spray of white foam. Underwater again, Thomas could see the shark recovering from its breach, reorienting toward his position with terrible purpose. The kelp was still 20 yards away, and the predator was now between Thomas and his destination. He backpedaled, trying to maintain maximum distance while assessing his dwindling options. The shark charged again, accelerating with astonishing speed. This time Thomas had nowhere to go, no kelp to hide in, no surface to breach. He twisted in the water, trying to present the smallest possible target, bringing his camera housing up as a makeshift shield. The impact was catastrophic. 15 feet and 2,000 pounds of muscle and cartilage slammed into Thomas, the shark's snout striking his torso before its mouth opened to secure its prey. Thomas felt an explosion of pain as the teeth found purchase in his left side, just below the ribs, puncturing through the wetsuit and into flesh. Water around him clouded red as the shark shook its head, the instinctive movement designed to tear flesh from bone. The pain was transcendent, pushing beyond the boundaries of normal sensation into a realm of pure white agony. Thomas struck out reflexively, his right fist connecting with the shark's sensitive nose, his left hand clawing at the creature's eye. Whether through luck or some primitive survival instinct, Thomas's defensive strikes hit vulnerable targets. The shark released its grip, momentarily confused by the unexpected resistance from what should have been passive prey. In that brief reprieve, Thomas kicked away with his remaining strength, the water around him billowing with his own blood. The great white circled, assessing this strange prey that fought back. Thomas knew he had seconds to act before blood loss weakened him, or the shark decided to press its advantage. The kelp forest remained his only chance, now 15 yards to his. Left? After the violent encounter had shifted their position, Thomas swam for the kelp with everything he had left, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through his torn side. The shark followed, but seemed more cautious now, tracking the blood trail rather than charging immediately. It was the behavior of a predator confident in its eventual success, willing to let the prey exhaust itself before the final strike. With a final desperate lunge, Thomas reached the outer strands of the kelp forest. He pulled himself deeper into the vegetative cover, wrapping strands of kelp around his body to help stay in place, without expenditure of his rapidly depleting energy. The shark prowled the perimeter, occasionally pushing partly into the kelp before withdrawing. Thomas checked his wound as best he could through the cloud of his own blood. The wetsuit made detailed assessment impossible, but he could feel multiple puncture wounds along his left side, the flesh torn and ragged. The cold water was actually helping, constricting blood vessels and potentially slowing the bleeding, though he knew hypothermia would become a concern if he remained immobile too long. The shore seemed impossibly distant. Thomas estimated he was still 200 yards out, a swim that would take several minutes even for a healthy person. In his current condition, with a great white shark circling, the prospect of reaching land seemed remote at best. His training reasserted itself through the haze of pain and fear. Survival situations required clear thinking and prioritization. First priority, don't get eaten. The kelp forest offered his best protection. Second priority, control bleeding. He pressed his right arm against the wound, applying pressure as best he could while maintaining his position in the kelp. Third priority, signal for help. Thomas remembered the emergency whistle attached to his buoyancy compensator. With his free hand, he fumbled for it, finally grasping the small plastic tube. He brought it to his lips and blew 3 sharp blasts, the universal distress signal. The high-pitched sound carried across the water, but Thomas had no way of knowing if anyone was close enough to hear it. Time passed in an agonizing crawl. The shark continued to circle, sometimes disappearing from view only to reappear from a different direction. Thomas clung to the kelp, applied pressure to his wound, and periodically blew his whistle. His extremities were beginning to feel numb. From blood loss, cold, or both, he couldn't tell. After what seemed like hours but was likely 20 minutes, Thomas heard the unmistakable sound of an outboard motor. He blew his whistle again, 3 long blasts, praying the sound would guide potential rescuers to his location. The motor grew louder, then cut to an idle. Thomas heard voices but couldn't make out words over the ringing that had developed in his ears. "Here!" he shouted, his voice weaker than he'd expected. "In the kelp. Shark." There was a moment of silence. Then the motor revved again, approaching cautiously. Thomas could now make out a small Boston whaler coming toward his position. 2 figures, visible on board. He recognized Sarah's ranger uniform and realized she must have gotten concerned when he didn't return on schedule. "Thomas," Sarah called, standing at the bow with a handheld speaker. "Can you swim to us? We can see a lot of blood in the water." "Shark," Thomas called back, his voice straining to carry. "Great white, still circling." The second figure, Thomas could now see it was another ranger he didn't recognize, conferred briefly with Sarah. The boat edged closer, now about 30 feet from Thomas's position in the kelp. "We can see it," Sarah confirmed, her voice at your 3 o'clock, about 40 feet out. Thomas didn't dare turn to look. "I'm injured, left side bite." The rangers exchanged another brief conversation. The male ranger disappeared into the small cabin and returned with what looked like a harpoon or spear gun. "Thomas," Sarah called, "we're going to create a diversion. When I tell you, I need you to swim directly to the boat as fast as you can. Don't stop, don't look back, understand?" Thomas managed a weak thumbs up with his free hand. The male ranger aimed the device. Thomas could now see it was some kind of compressed air horn attached to an extension pole, away from both Thomas and the boat, toward the open water. He triggered it, and an ear-splitting blast echoed across the bay, followed by a second and third in rapid succession. "Now, Thomas," Sarah shouted. "Swim!" Thomas released his hold on the kelp and kicked toward the boat with every ounce of strength he could muster. The pain in his side flared with each movement, but survival instinct pushed him through it. The distance to the boat seemed to stretch endlessly before him. Behind him, he could hear the air horn continuing to sound at irregular intervals, presumably tracking the shark's movements and attempting to discourage it from pursuing its wounded prey. Thomas didn't look back, focusing entirely on the bow of the boat, now just 15 feet away. Sarah extended a boat hook toward him. "Grab on!" Thomas reached for the pole, his bloody fingers slipping once before finding purchase. Sarah and the male ranger pulled steadily, drawing him to the side of the vessel. With their help, Thomas managed to drape his upper body over the gunwale. The rangers grabbed his arms and, on a count of 3, heaved him onto the deck in a splash of seawater and blood. "Go, go, go!" Sarah shouted to her colleague, who immediately jumped behind the wheel and opened the throttle. The boat leaped forward, speeding away from the kelp forest and the predator that lurked there. Thomas lay on the deck, gasping, as Sarah knelt beside him and began assessing his injuries. "Jesus," she muttered, peeling back the torn wetsuit to reveal the extent of the damage. "Mike, radio ahead. Shark attack victim, multiple lacerations, significant blood loss. We need an ambulance at the marina, ASAP." Mike nodded, grabbing the radio handset and relaying the information while maintaining their course toward shore. Sarah grabbed a first aid kit from under a seat and began applying pressure bandages to Thomas's wounds. "You're going to be okay," she said, her voice professionally calm despite the gravity of the situation. "The bites don't appear to have hit any major arteries, or you'd already be." She didn't finish the sentence. "Camera," Thomas said weakly, suddenly remembering the expensive equipment that had been attached to his wrist. Somehow it was still there, the housing cracked but intact. "Really?" Sarah gave him an incredulous look. "You're worried about your camera right now?" "Evidence," Thomas managed. "Got pictures before." Understanding dawned on Sarah's face. "Of the shark? Before it attacked?" Thomas nodded slightly, then winced as Sarah applied another pressure bandage. "That might actually be useful for the marine researchers," she acknowledged. "But let's focus on keeping you alive first, okay?" The trip back to the marina passed in a blur for Thomas. Shock was setting in, the initial adrenaline fading to leave room for the full impact of pain and trauma. He drifted in and out of awareness, catching fragments of conversation between Sarah and Mike, the crackle of the radio, the steady rhythm of the boat slapping against the waves. When they reached the marina, an ambulance was already waiting, its emergency lights flashing silently in the late morning sun. Paramedics swarmed the boat as soon as it was secured to the dock, transferring Thomas to a backboard and then a gurney with practiced efficiency. "Adult male, approximately 40 years old, shark bite victim," Sarah reported to the lead paramedic. "Multiple lacerations to the left torso, significant blood loss, possible internal injuries. We applied pressure bandages on site approximately 15 minutes ago." The paramedic nodded, already connecting monitoring equipment to Thomas. "BP 90 over 60, pulse 130 and thready," he reported to his partner. "Let's get 2 large-bore IVs started and push fluids wide open, and call ahead to Stanford Medical. Their trauma center has experience with marine animal attacks." Thomas felt a sharp prick as a needle entered his arm, followed by the cold sensation of intravenous fluids beginning to flow. An oxygen mask was placed over his face, and he heard the ambulance doors slam shut around him. The siren activated, its wail oddly distant to his ears. "Thomas!" the paramedic said, leaning close to be heard over the siren and road noise. "My name's Jason. We're taking you to Stanford Medical Center. It's about a 30-minute ride. I need you to stay with me, okay? Can you tell me what day it is?" Thomas tried to focus his thoughts through the haze of shock and pain. "Saturday," he managed. "October 5th. "Good," Jason said, adjusting something on one of the IV bags. "And do you remember what happened to you?" "Shark," Thomas replied. "Great white. I was photographing kelp forest. It came out of nowhere." "You're doing great," Jason assured him, checking the pressure bandages Sarah had applied. "We're going to take good care of you." The remainder of the ambulance ride passed in fragments for Thomas. The paramedics worked efficiently around him, monitoring his vital signs, administering medications, periodically calling ahead to update the hospital on their status and his condition. Thomas drifted between sharp clarity and foggy disconnection, the pain sometimes receding to a distant throb, other times flaring with such intensity that he gasped despite the pain medication flowing through his veins. Stanford Medical Center appeared suddenly through the ambulance windows, a sprawling modern complex of buildings and parking structures. The ambulance pulled up to the emergency department entrance, where a trauma team was already waiting. The transition from ambulance to hospital was a chaotic blur of activity and voices. Thomas was wheeled through automatic doors into the bright lights of the trauma bay, surrounded immediately by doctors, nurses, and technicians, all focused on specific tasks. This is Thomas Reeves, 42-year-old male shark attack victim, approximately 90 minutes ago, Jason reported to the lead physician, a tall woman with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun. Multiple lacerations to the left torso. BP has stabilized at 170 with 2 liters of fluid, pulse 1 to 10. Oxygen saturation 96% on 4 liters. He's received 10 milligrams of morphine for pain management. The physician nodded sharply. Thank you, we've got him from here. Mr. Reeves, I'm Dr. Abernathy, trauma surgeon. We're going to take excellent care of you. Right now, we need to assess your injuries completely, which means cutting away your wetsuit and examining the wounds, okay? Thomas managed a nod, and the team sprang into action. Trauma shears made quick work of his wetsuit, the thick neoprene falling away to fully reveal the damage beneath. Thomas couldn't see his injuries from his position, but the sudden silence that fell over the team told him the wounds were significant. Let's get X-ray and ultrasound in here, Stat, Dr. Abernathy ordered. I want to rule out internal injuries before we take him to the OR. And Page Plastics. We're going to need them for closure. A technician appeared with a portable X-ray machine, positioning it over Thomas's torso. The room cleared briefly while images were taken, then refilled with activity. No obvious rib fractures, Dr. Abernathy announced, studying the images on a monitor. That's good news. Ultrasound shows no free fluid in the abdomen, so we may have gotten lucky with the internal organs. Let's get those wounds debrided and closed before our luck runs out. Or 3 is prepped and waiting. Thomas was transferred to a different gurney and whisked through corridors to an elevator which carried him to the surgical floor. The last thing he remembered before the anesthesia took effect was the cool sensation of antiseptic being painted across his skin and the anesthesiologist's calm voice counting backward from 10. He made it to 8. Thomas awoke gradually, consciousness returning in layers. First came awareness of existence, then sensation, the soft pressure of sheets against his skin, the rhythmic beeping of monitoring equipment, the dull ache in his side muted by medication. Finally, he opened his eyes to the muted lighting of a hospital room. "Welcome back," said a voice to his right. Thomas turned his head slightly to see Sarah sitting in a visitor's chair, still in her ranger uniform, though it looked significantly more rumpled than the last time he'd seen her. "How long?" Thomas managed, his throat dry and voice raspy. Sarah checked her watch. "About 6 hours since they took you into surgery. It's just past 7 in the evening." She reached for a cup of ice chips on the bedside table and offered him one. Thomas accepted gratefully, the melting ice soothing his parched throat. "The doctor said the surgery went well," Sarah continued. "The shark got you with 6 separate puncture wounds, but somehow missed anything vital. They had to debride the wounds, remove damaged tissue, and give you a lot of stitches, both internal and external. You'll have some impressive scars, but no lasting functional damage." Thomas attempted to shift position and was rewarded with a spike of pain that cut through the medication haze. "I wouldn't try moving too much just yet," Sarah advised. "The surgeon said you have over 100 stitches holding you together." "The shark?" Thomas asked. "No sign of it after we picked you up," Sarah replied. "Mike and I went back out with some of the Marine Sanctuary researchers once you were safely in the ambulance. They wanted to track it if possible, both for public safety and research purposes. But great whites don't usually stick around long after an encounter like that." Thomas nodded slightly, remembering something from his marine biology studies. Great whites rarely consumed humans, often taking an exploratory bite before realizing the bony, lean human form wasn't the blubber-rich seal or sea lion they preferred. So unfortunately, even an exploratory bite from a creature with such powerful jaws and teeth was potentially fatal to humans. "My camera?" he asked. "Right here," Sarah said, lifting his waterproof camera housing from beside her chair. "The housing is cracked, but the memory card seemed intact. The marine researchers are very interested in any images you might have captured before the attack." A nurse entered the room, interrupting their conversation. "Ah, you're awake, Mr. Reeves. How's your pain level on a scale of 1 to 10? Thomas considered the throbbing ache in his side. 4, maybe. 5? The nurse checked his vital signs and adjusted his IV. "Dr. Abernathy will be by shortly to discuss your surgery and recovery. Is there anyone else you'd like us to contact? Family?" Thomas shook his head slightly. His parents had passed away years ago, and his sister lived in Maine with her family. They spoke maybe twice a year. "No one urgently," he replied. "I'll make some calls tomorrow." The nurse nodded and left, promising to return with additional pain medication if needed. The local paper called the ranger station, Sarah mentioned once they were alone again. Someone at the marina apparently tipped them off about a shark attack. They wanted details for a story. "What did you tell them?" Thomas asked. "Nothing specific," Sarah assured him. "Just confirmed there had been an incident involving a diver and a shark, and that the diver had been transported to the hospital with non-life-threatening injuries. No names or details." Thomas nodded appreciatively. The last thing he wanted was media attention, or to become the focus of sensationalist shark attack stories that inevitably led to unnecessary fear and sometimes culling of shark populations. Dr. Abernathy arrived 30 minutes later, reviewing Thomas's chart before addressing him directly. "Mr. Reeves, you're an exceptionally lucky man," she began without preamble. "Based on the pattern and depth of your wounds, you encountered what was likely a large great white shark, 15 feet or more judging by the bite radius. The fact that you're alive to tell the tale puts you in a very select group." She pulled up his hospital gown just enough to reveal the extensive bandaging that wrapped around his torso. "The shark's teeth penetrated your left side in 6 places, creating lacerations ranging from 2 to 7 inches deep. We removed some foreign material, most likely teeth fragments that broke off during the attack, which happens commonly. We've preserved those for the marine researchers who've already been in contact." "When can I go home?" Thomas asked, the hospital environment already making him restless despite his condition. Dr. Abernathy raised an eyebrow. "Not for at least 3 days, possibly longer. We need to monitor for infection, which is a significant concern with marine animal bites. The ocean contains numerous bacteria that can cause serious complications if not properly treated. You're receiving broad-spectrum antibiotics intravenously now, and we'll transition you to oral antibiotics before discharge, which you'll continue for at least 2 weeks." She made some notes in his chart. "Once you're discharged, you'll need to keep the wounds clean and dry for at least 3 weeks. No swimming, no diving, no strenuous activity of any kind until cleared by your follow-up physician. The internal stitches will dissolve on their own, but you'll need to have the external ones removed in about 10 days. Thomas nodded, though. The prospect of weeks away from the ocean felt almost as painful as his physical injuries. "I've treated several shark attack survivors over my career," Dr. Abernathy added, her tone softening slightly. "The physical recovery is only part of the journey. Many experience significant psychological effects, PTSD, anxiety, nightmares. We have excellent trauma counselors on staff, and I'd strongly recommend you speak with one before discharge." "I'll consider it," Thomas replied noncommittally. He'd always processed his experiences internally, working through them in his own time and way. Dr. Abernathy seemed to read his reluctance. "Just think about it. In the meantime, try to rest. Your body has experienced significant trauma and needs time to heal." After the doctor left, Sarah stood and gathered her things. "I should get going. My shift ended hours ago, and I need to file the incident report." "Thank you," Thomas said sincerely, "for coming back to check on me, and for saving my life out there." Sarah shrugged, though her expression suggested she was more affected than she wanted to admit. "Just doing my job. Besides, you're one of our regulars. The cove wouldn't be the same without you photographing everything that moves." She paused at the door. "For what it's worth, I hope this doesn't keep you out of the water permanently. But maybe consider diving with a buddy from now on." Thomas managed a small smile. "I'll take it under advisement." After Sarah left, Thomas was alone with his thoughts and the steady beeping of the monitors. Despite the medication, he could feel every one of the wounds in his side, a constellation of pain points that flared with each breath or slight movement. But beneath the physical discomfort lay something deeper, a fundamental shift in his relationship with the ocean. For 25 years, he'd immersed himself in marine environments with the confident ease of someone who felt at home there. The ocean had been his sanctuary, his workplace, his passion. Now, for the first time, he'd experienced its indifferent potential for destruction. The great white hadn't attacked him out of malice or aggression. It had simply been following millions of years of evolutionary programming, identifying a potential prey item and investigating it the only way it knew how. Thomas didn't blame the shark. How could he? It would be like blaming gravity for a fall or fire for a burn, but knowledge didn't automatically translate to emotional processing. He wondered if he would ever be able to slip beneath the surface, again without feeling the phantom pressure of jaws closing around his torso. These thoughts circled through his mind as exhaustion gradually overtook him, pulling him down into a fitful sleep, punctuated by dreams of dark shapes moving through kelp forests and the sensation of falling through endless blue water. The following morning brought a stream of visitors that Thomas hadn't anticipated. First came 2 marine biologists from the Monterey Bay Aquarium's shark research program, eager to document his encounter and view any photographic evidence he might have captured. They brought a laptop to review the images recovered from his camera. "These are remarkable," said Dr. Elaine Matheson, the lead researcher, scrolling through photos Thomas had taken just minutes before the attack. "The visibility that day was exceptional, and here, you can actually see the shark in the background. Of this image, though, I don't think you noticed it at the time." She turned the screen toward Thomas, who was sitting up in bed with the assistance of an adjustable hospital bed. Sure enough, in the far corner of an otherwise beautiful kelp forest composition, a distinctive torpedo shape was just barely visible, partially obscured by the vegetation. "It was tracking you," said her colleague, Dr. Rafael Navarro. "Probably had been for several minutes before the attack. Great whites are ambush predators. They prefer to observe potential prey before committing to an approach." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the hospital's air conditioning. The thought of being watched, assessed, and calculated as a potential meal was profoundly unsettling. "We'd like to include your case in our ongoing research on great white behavior and human interactions," Dr. Matheson continued. "With your permission, of course. The combination of your first-hand account and these images provides valuable data." "Of course," Thomas agreed. "Whatever helps increase understanding, though I'm not sure I remember all the details clearly. Everything happened so fast." "That's common in traumatic events," Dr. Navarro assured him. "Memory consolidation is affected by extreme stress, but even fragmented recollections can be useful when combined with photographic evidence." After the researchers left, promising to follow up once Thomas had been discharged, a local sheriff's deputy arrived to take an official statement for the incident report. The conversation was brief and technical, focusing on location, timing, and factual details rather than Thomas's subjective experience. "Will there be any kind of response?" Thomas asked as the deputy prepared to leave. "Attempts to locate the shark or warn other water users?" The deputy shook his head. "The marine sanctuary regulations prohibit hunting or culling sharks, even after an incident like yours. The Ranger Service has posted temporary advisory notices at access points along that stretch of coastline, but that's the extent of the official response. The ocean remains the ocean, you know. We're just visitors there." Thomas nodded, finding himself in complete agreement despite his recent experience. That's as it should be. By afternoon, he'd received visits from a physical therapist to discuss recovery exercises, a hospital social worker offering assistance with insurance and disability paperwork, and a trauma counselor who left her card after a brief, non-committal conversation that convinced Thomas he wasn't ready to process the psychological aspects of the attack just yet. He was dozing lightly when a knock at the door announced another visitor, Mike, the ranger who had been with Sarah during the rescue. "Hey," Mike said, looking somewhat uncomfortable. "Just wanted to check how you're doing. And to give you this," he held up Thomas's weight belt, the only piece of equipment they'd managed to recover besides the camera. "Thanks," Thomas said, genuinely appreciative of the gesture, "and thank you for yesterday. I don't think I was very coherent at the time." Mike waved off the gratitude. "All in a day's work, though I have to admit it was my first shark attack response in 12 years with the service." He placed the weight belt on the bedside table. "Listen, I don't want to stress you out or anything, but I thought you should know there's been some media attention. Nothing major, just the local paper and one of the regional TV stations they ran. Stories about the attack this morning." Thomas sighed. "Did they use my name?" "No, the official reports keep victims anonymous, but, well, it's a small community. People talk. The marina staff knew it was you, and word gets around." "I was afraid of that," Thomas admitted. "I've already had a few calls on my cell that I've been ignoring, numbers I don't recognize." Mike nodded sympathetically. "It'll blow over in a few days. News cycle is short these days, but I wanted to give you a heads up in case any reporters try to contact you directly." After Mike left, Thomas reached for his phone and, against his better judgment, searched for news about the attack. As expected, the local coverage was somewhat sensationalized, with headlines like "Jaws off Monterey, local diver survives great white attack," and "Shark terror in California waters." The stories themselves were light on facts but heavy on drama, describing a vicious attack and deadly encounter, despite having few actual details about what had occurred. One article quoted an anonymous witness claiming the shark had been at least 20 feet long and had repeatedly attacked the helpless diver, neither of which was accurate. More concerning to Thomas were the comment sections beneath the online articles, where readers were already calling for increased beach patrols, shark nets, or even culling programs to protect the public from man-eating monsters. It was exactly the kind of uninformed reaction that marine conservationists dreaded after any shark incident. With a mixture of frustration and resignation, Thomas composed a brief email to his contacts at the Ocean Conservancy and the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation, organizations he'd worked with frequently over the years. He explained what had happened in factual terms, emphasized that he did not blame the shark for behaving according to its nature, and offered to assist with any public education efforts that might help counter the sensationalist coverage. That task completed, he turned his attention to the practical matters of recovery. The hospital social worker had left paperwork regarding short-term disability benefits, which Thomas would need given that his freelance photography work would be impossible during his recovery period. His health insurance would cover most of the hospital expenses, but he'd still face significant out-of-pocket costs and weeks without income. These mundane concerns were almost welcome distractions from the deeper questions lurking beneath the surface of his thoughts. Would he ever feel comfortable in the water again? Could he return to the work that had defined his professional identity for over a decade? And if not, what would replace it? The evening brought another visit from Sarah, who arrived after her shift, carrying a small potted succulent and a slightly apologetic expression. "I'm not great with the whole flowers thing," she explained, placing the hardy desert plant on the windowsill, "but I figured this might survive your apartment during your recovery." "It's perfect," Thomas assured her. "Low maintenance, like me." Sarah smiled and took a seat. "How are you feeling?" "Really?" Thomas considered the question. "Physically? Like I got chewed up and spit out by a prehistoric predator. The pain meds help, but every time they start to wear off, I'm reminded of exactly how many teeth that thing had." "And non-physically?" Sarah pressed gently. Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," he admitted finally. "It still doesn't feel quite real, like it happened to someone else, and I'm just hearing about it secondhand." Sarah nodded. "That's normal after trauma. Dissociation, they call it. You sound like the trauma counselor who stopped by this morning." "Part of our training," Sarah explained. "Rangers deal with all kinds of visitor incidents, some of them pretty terrible. They teach us to recognize the signs of traumatic stress, both in victims and in ourselves." "And do you deal with traumatic stress, I mean?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. Sarah considered the question. "Sometimes. Not often, thankfully. We had a drowning last year. A kid who got caught in a rip current. That one stuck with me for a while." She paused, then added, "Yesterday was rough too. There was a lot of blood in that water, Thomas. For a minute there, I wasn't sure we'd gotten to you in time." "I'm glad you did," Thomas said simply. "Me too." Sarah seemed to shake off the seriousness, straightening in her chair. "Anyway, I brought something else you might find interesting." She pulled a tablet from her bag and opened a file. The marine researchers set up a drone survey of the area after the attack. They captured this about 2 miles offshore late yesterday afternoon. She handed Thomas the tablet, which displayed a high-resolution aerial image of a great white shark swimming near the surface. Even from above, its size was impressive, easily 15 feet long, its distinctive coloration and shape unmistakable. "They think it's the same one?" Thomas asked, studying the image with a mixture of scientific interest and visceral unease. "Size and location suggest it could be," Sarah replied. "Great whites are territorial and tend to patrol specific areas. The researchers are calling her Monterey Mary for now. They track individuals when possible." "She," Thomas repeated. "A female?" Sarah nodded. "Based on the size and body shape. Female great whites grow larger than males, often reaching 15 to 16 feet, sometimes more. Males typically top out around 13 to 14 feet. Thomas handed the tablet back, feeling strangely conflicted. There was something oddly personal about seeing the creature that had nearly killed him, about knowing it had a designation, an identity of sorts. It made the experience both more real and more complicated emotionally. What will happen to her? Will they track her movements? If they can, Sarah said, great whites are notoriously difficult to monitor long-term. They dive deep, travel vast distances, and don't need to surface to breathe like marine mammals do. But they've placed some additional acoustic receivers in the area, hoping to pick up signals if she's been previously tagged or returns after being tagged in the future. Their conversation was interrupted by a nurse arriving to check Thomas's vital signs and change his bandages. Sarah excused herself to give him privacy, promising to check in again before he was discharged. The wound care procedure was uncomfortable, but necessary. As the nurse carefully removed the old dressings, Thomas got his first real look at the damage. 6 distinct puncture wounds marked his left side, each surrounded by bruising that had bloomed into spectacular purples and blues. The largest wound, just below his ribcage, was nearly 7 inches long and secured with neat surgical stitches that traced a curved line following the shape of the shark's jaw. "They're looking good," the nurse assured him, gently cleaning the area with antiseptic. "No signs of infection so far, which is our biggest concern with marine animal bites. Will the scarring be significant?" Thomas asked, already knowing the answer, but seeking confirmation. The nurse was honest, but kind. "Yes, you'll have noticeable scars. The plastic surgeon did excellent work minimizing them, but given the depth and nature of the wounds, there's only so much that can be done. You might consider scar revision procedures down the road if they bother you cosmetically." Thomas shook his head slightly. "No, that's not necessary. I was just curious." In truth, he wasn't particularly concerned about the aesthetic impact. His body already carried the marks of his years exploring wild places, a burn scar on his calf from a too-close encounter with a volcanic vent in Hawaii, a jagged line across his palm where a moray eel had objected to his proximity, countless small nicks and scars from coral cuts and barnacle scrapes. These new marks would simply join the collection, albeit more dramatically than most. After the nurse finished applying fresh bandages and left, Thomas found himself alone with his thoughts. Again. He reached for his phone and opened the marine tracking application he'd used for years to monitor ocean conditions and marine life sightings along the California coast. There, under recent reports, was an entry from the previous day. Great white shark, estimated 15-16 feet female, observed offshore from Monterey Marine Sanctuary. Tagged as Monterey Mary in research database, exercise extreme caution in area. Thomas stared at the entry for a long moment, then did something that surprised him. He saved the entry to his favorites list, creating a bookmark that would allow him to follow future sightings of this particular shark. He wasn't sure why he felt compelled to do so. Perhaps it was a scientist's instinct to study what had harmed him, or perhaps something deeper, a need to transform a random attack into something with meaning and continuity. The next 2 days passed in a routine of medications, wound care, brief walks in the hospital corridor to prevent complications, and visits from medical professionals monitoring his recovery. Thomas used the time to begin processing his experience, both practically and emotionally. He spoke with his insurance company, filed the necessary paperwork for short-term disability benefits, and contacted clients to reschedule or cancel upcoming assignments. Most were understanding, especially once they learned the reason. A shark attack carried a certain dramatic weight that tended to override normal business concerns. Emotionally, the process was less straightforward. Thomas experienced his first nightmare on the second night after surgery, a vivid dream of being trapped in kelp, while a massive shadow circled below, steadily rising toward him as he struggled to free himself. He awoke gasping, his heart racing, phantom pain flaring in his wounds despite the medication. By the morning of the 4th day, Dr. Abernathy deemed him stable enough for discharge, though with strict instructions for continued care at home. "The antibiotics are non-negotiable," she emphasized, handing him prescriptions. "Take them exactly as directed, even if you feel fine. Marine bacteria can cause infections days or even weeks after initial injury." Thomas nodded, already dressed in loose clothing that Sarah had brought from his apartment the previous day. Even the simple act of dressing had been challenging, each movement pulling at his stitches and sending reminders of his injuries. "And please," Dr. Abernathy added, "consider the trauma counseling. Here's the referral information for a therapist who specializes in survivors of life-threatening events. You don't have to call immediately, but keep it as an option. Thomas accepted the card with non-committal thanks. He wasn't opposed to the idea of counseling in principle, but he'd always processed difficult experiences through solitude and reflection, usually while immersed in his photography work. The prospect of discussing his feelings with a stranger seemed both foreign and unnecessary. Sarah arrived to drive him home, having volunteered when she learned he was being discharged. The short journey from Stanford to Thomas's apartment in Monterey was mostly silent, both of them aware of the significance of his return to normal life after the extraordinary events of the past 4 days. Thomas's apartment was a modest one-bedroom unit in an older building near Cannery Row, chosen primarily for its proximity to the ocean and affordable rent that allowed him to pursue his sometimes financially unpredictable career. The space reflected his priorities: minimal furniture and household items, but an entire wall dedicated to professional photography equipment, books on marine biology and ocean ecology, and framed prints of his most significant work. "Home. Sweet home," Sarah said, helping him inside and setting his small bag of personal effects on the kitchen counter. "Can I get you anything before I head out? Set you up with some food, water, medications?" Thomas shook his head. "I'm okay, really. I can manage from here." Seeing her skeptical expression, he added, "If I need anything, I promise I'll call. I'm not going to be stubborn about it." Sarah seemed satisfied with this assurance. "All right, but I'm serious. Call if you need help, and I'll check in tomorrow to see how you're doing." After she left, Thomas stood in the middle of his living room, suddenly uncertain what to do with himself. Normal routines seemed inappropriate after the life-altering experience he'd just endured, yet he had no alternative structure to replace them. Eventually, he settled on the simple necessities, arranging his medications on the kitchen counter, organizing the wound care supplies the hospital had provided, and preparing simple food that would require minimal effort. That evening, feeling restless despite his physical limitations, Thomas retrieved his camera from the bag Sarah had brought. The housing was indeed cracked, the impact of the shark's body having damaged the waterproof case, but the camera itself seemed intact. He connected it to his computer and began downloading the images from his interrupted dive session. The photos were remarkable, not just for their composition and technical quality. Thomas had always been skilled at capturing the ethereal beauty of underwater environments, but for the knowledge of what had followed. The peaceful kelp forest scenes, the schools of fish moving in synchronized patterns, the play of light through water, all seemed imbued with an ominous quality in retrospect, knowing that a predator had been moving through that same environment, unseen until the final moments. And then he found it, the last image captured before the attack. It had been taken moments after Thomas noticed the change in fish behavior, when he'd rotated in the water column to scan his surroundings. The photo was slightly blurred, suggesting he'd been in motion when he triggered the shutter, but the subject was unmistakable. The great white shark partially emerged from the kelp forest edge, its body oriented directly toward the camera position, its mouth slightly open, revealing the first row of triangular teeth. Thomas stared at the image for a long time, feeling a complex mix of emotions. There was fear, certainly, the visceral reaction to seeing the predator that had nearly killed him, but there was also something like awe, a recognition of the creature's perfect adaptation to its environment, its power and evolutionary refinement. And beneath both those reactions lay a strange sense of connection. This specific animal, and he were now linked by an experience that had permanently altered his life and would likely be recorded in the scientific literature, documenting human-shark interactions. On impulse, Thomas opened his image editing software and began working with the photo. Despite the slight blur, the composition was striking, the shark emerging from the green-blue haze of the kelp forest, a hunter in its element. With careful adjustments to contrast, clarity, and color balance, he transformed the somewhat chaotic final shot into something almost artistic, a wildlife photograph that captured not just the animal, but the moment of contact between two species, predator and prey, in an environment that belonged to one and was merely visited by the other. When he was satisfied with the edit, Thomas saved the file, then attached it to emails addressed to the marine biologists who had visited him in the hospital. "Thought you might find this useful for your research," he wrote simply. the last image captured before the attack. He hesitated before sending, suddenly uncertain about sharing such a personal and traumatic moment. But the scientist in him recognized the value of the image for researchers studying great white behavior. And perhaps there was also a therapeutic aspect to transforming the experience from something that happened to him into something he could control and contextualize through his professional skills. Thomas clicked send, then closed his laptop. The process of reviewing and editing the images had been more emotionally draining than he'd anticipated, leaving him physically exhausted despite having done little more than sit at his desk. He carefully prepared for bed, taking his evening medications and arranging pillows to support his injured side before settling into what he hoped would be restful sleep. The next week passed in a blur of mundane recovery activities, punctuated by moments of unexpected emotional response. Thomas followed his medical instructions diligently, changing bandages, taking medications, and gradually increasing his physical activity as permitted. He received periodic check-in visits from Sarah and phone calls from the marine researchers, who were enthusiastic about the photographs he'd shared and eager to incorporate his experience into their ongoing studies. Local media interest in the Yeo attack faded quickly as Mike had predicted, replaced by newer stories about city council decisions and high school sports achievements. Thomas declined the few interview requests that reached him directly, preferring to maintain his privacy and avoid becoming temporarily famous for what had been the most vulnerable moment of his life. Physical recovery progressed steadily. By the end of the first week at home, Thomas could move around his apartment with minimal discomfort, though certain movements still triggered sharp reminders of his injuries. The bruising around his wounds had evolved from deep purple to yellowing green, spreading across his torso in a visual testament to the force of the impact. What progressed less predictably was his psychological processing of the event. Thomas experienced vivid nightmares several times, always with the same theme: being in the water, sensing a presence, and feeling the terrible vulnerability of human flesh in an environment where he was neither the fastest nor the strongest creature. He began avoiding documentaries or news segments about sharks, finding that even scientific presentations triggered an unwelcome physical response: elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the temperature of his apartment. 10 days after the attack, Thomas returned to Stanford Medical Center to have his external stitches removed. The procedure was quick and relatively painless, performed by a nurse practitioner who complimented the healing progress. "The scarring will be significant but clean," she told him, applying adhesive strips to support the newly closed wounds. "Keep using the silicone sheets we provided. They'll help minimize the appearance over time." "When can I return to diving?" Thomas asked, the question that had been foremost in his mind throughout recovery. The nurse practitioner consulted his chart. "Dr. Abernathy recommends no water activities for at least 6 weeks from the date of injury, and no strenuous activities like free diving for a minimum of 3 months. Even then, you'll need to be cleared by a physician before returning to your previous level of activity." Thomas nodded, having expected something along these lines but still feeling the weight of the restriction. 3 months away from the ocean felt like an eternity for someone whose life and livelihood had been built around marine environments. "And have you considered talking with someone about the psychological aspects of your experience?" she asked, affixing the last adhesive strip. "Dr. Abernathy noted a referral to trauma counseling in your discharge notes." "I'm handling it," Thomas replied, not entirely truthfully, "just taking things day by day." The nurse practitioner seemed skeptical but didn't press the issue further. "Well, the offer stands if you change your mind. Many shark attack survivors find the emotional recovery more challenging than the physical one." That evening, Thomas stood at the window of his apartment, looking out toward the bay. The ocean was visible as a sliver of blue on the horizon, beautiful and inviting in the golden light of sunset. For the first time since the attack, he felt a genuine longing to return to the water, not just as an abstract desire to resume his work, but as a visceral need to reconnect with the environment that had defined so much of his life. Yet alongside that longing ran an undercurrent of fear that he couldn't easily dismiss. The rational part of his brain understood the statistical reality. Shark attacks were incredibly rare, fatal ones even more so. He had encountered thousands of marine creatures over his diving career without incident. But rationality was cold comfort against the vivid memory of teeth puncturing flesh. of the ocean around him turning red with his own blood. On impulse, Thomas reached for his phone and dialed the number on the card Dr. Abernathy had given him. Pacific. Coast Trauma Counseling, this is Andrea, answered a warm professional voice. Hello, my name is Thomas Reeves, he began, suddenly uncertain how to continue. I was given this number by Dr. Abernathy at Stanford. I was attacked by a shark 2 weeks ago, and I think I might need to talk to someone about it. I'm glad you called, Mr. Reeves, Andrea replied, her tone suggesting this was neither an unusual request nor something to be embarrassed about. We have several counselors who specialize in trauma related to near-death experiences. When would you like to schedule your first session? 2 days later, Thomas found himself in a comfortable office overlooking a small garden, seated across from Dr. Eleanor Patel, a trauma specialist with 20 years of experience working with accident and attack survivors. Before we begin, Dr. Patel said after introductions had been completed, I want you to know that there's no right way to respond to what you experienced. Some people find they can process trauma relatively quickly with proper support, while others need more time. Neither approach is better or worse. They're simply different paths through difficult terrain. Thomas nodded, appreciating the lack of pressure in her approach. So, she continued, in your own words, what brings you here today? Thomas took a deep breath. 2 weeks ago, I was attacked by a great white shark while freediving near Monterey. I survived, obviously, but I'm finding that the experience has changed things. Changed me, maybe, and I don't know how to navigate that. Dr. Patel nodded encouragingly. Can you tell me more about what feels different now? I've been diving for over 25 years, Thomas explained. The ocean has always been where I feel most at home, most myself. My work, my passion, my sense of purpose, they're all tied to being in the water, but now, he paused, searching for the right words. Now there's this barrier, this hesitation. I have nightmares about being in the water. I flinch when I see images of sharks on TV, and I don't know if I'll ever be able to dive again without feeling haunted by what happened. Those are very natural responses to trauma, Dr. Patel assured him. Your body and mind experience something genuinely life-threatening, and they're trying to protect you from similar dangers in the future. It's an adaptive response, even if it feels disruptive, to the life you want to lead. Their conversation continued for the full hour, Dr. Patel asking thoughtful questions about Thomas's experience, his emotional responses in the moment and afterward, and his concerns about the future. She offered no quick solutions or platitudes about everything returning to normal, which Thomas found oddly comforting in its honesty. For next week, Dr. Patel suggested as their session drew to a close, I'd like you to keep a brief journal of moments when you think about the attack or have physical responses related to it. Just note the situation, the thoughts that arise, and how intense the response feels on a scale of 1 to 10. This will help us identify patterns and potential triggers. Thomas agreed, finding the concrete task more appealing than vague instructions to process his feelings. Over the next several weeks, Thomas settled into a routine that balanced physical recovery with psychological work. He attended weekly sessions with Dr. Patel, maintained his journal as requested, and gradually incorporated therapeutic techniques she suggested for managing anxiety and intrusive thoughts related to the attack. Physically, his wounds healed steadily. The puncture sites formed raised pinkish scars that would likely fade to white over time, but would never disappear completely. Thomas found he didn't mind them as much as he might have expected. They were, in a way, a testament to survival, to an experience few humans shared. 6 weeks after the attack, Thomas received clearance from his follow-up physician to resume lightwater activities, though with strict limitations. No solo excursions, no deep water, no marine environments known for shark activity. It was a significant milestone in his recovery, one he approached with mixed emotions. How do you feel about potentially returning to the water? Dr. Patel asked during their session that week. Conflicted, Thomas admitted. Part of me is desperate to get back. It's been the longest I've been out of the ocean since I was a teenager. But another part is hesitant. Not just afraid, though there is that. It's more complicated. Can you elaborate on the complication? Dr. Patel prompted. Thomas considered the question. The ocean has always been a place where I felt completely present, completely connected. The moment I slipped beneath the surface, everything else fell away. Worries, distractions, the artificial constructs of human society. It was pure experience. But now I'm afraid I'll take my human baggage with me, that I'll be constantly scanning for shadows, jumping at movements, unable to find that state of pure presence because part of my mind will always be on alert. Dr. Patel nodded thoughtfully. That's a profound concern and an honest one. Many trauma survivors mourn not just what happened to them, but what it changed. The loss of a certain way of experiencing the world. So how do I get that back? Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. You may not get back exactly what you had before, Dr. Patel replied gently. Significant experiences change us. That's simply human nature. But you can develop a new relationship with the ocean, one that honors both your love for that environment and your lived experience of its dangers. It won't be the same, but it can still be meaningful and fulfilling. The following Saturday, Thomas stood on the same small beach where he had entered the water that fateful October morning. This time, however, he wasn't alone. Sarah had volunteered to accompany him for his first return to the ocean, a gesture of support that Thomas had gratefully accepted. You sure about this? Sarah asked, adjusting her wetsuit. Unlike Thomas, she wasn't an experienced diver, but she was a strong swimmer comfortable in ocean conditions. We can always start somewhere else, maybe a protected cove or even a pool. Thomas shook his head. It needs to be here. If I'm going to make peace with what happened, I can't avoid the place where it occurred. They had chosen a simple activity for this first excursion, surface snorkeling in the shallow waters near shore, no more, then 10 feet deep and well within the protected area, where the kelp forest hadn't yet fully established. Thomas had brought a basic underwater camera, nothing requiring freediving or extended submersion. With deliberate movements, Thomas prepared his gear, the routine familiar, yet now laden with new significance. Each action, adjusting his mask, checking his snorkel, securing his fins, carried the weight of memory of the last time he had performed these tasks before his life had changed so dramatically. Ready when you are, Sarah said, already standing ankle-deep in the gentle surf. Thomas took a deep breath and joined her at the water's edge. The cold Pacific water swirled around his feet, a sensation both familiar and suddenly strange. He moved forward slowly, feeling the pull of the receding wave, the slight resistance of the incoming one, the texture of sand shifting beneath his feet. As the water reached his waist, Thomas experienced the first real test of his recovery, a momentary spike of panic as his body remembered being vulnerable in this environment. His heart rate accelerated, his breathing became shallow, and for a second, he considered turning back. You okay? Sarah asked, noticing his hesitation. Thomas implemented the grounding technique Dr. Patel had taught him, acknowledging the anxiety without being consumed by it, focusing on concrete sensory input, reminding himself of the present reality rather than past trauma. Yeah, he replied after a moment, just processing. They continued wading out until the water reached chest height. Thomas placed his mask over his face, checked the seal, positioned his snorkel, and then with one final deep breath of preparation, lowered his face into the water. The underwater world greeted him with its familiar beauty, sunlight filtering through the surface in dancing patterns, small fish darting among strands of nearer shore kelp, the gentle movement of anemones attached to rocky outcroppings. It was, in many ways, exactly as he remembered it, a realm of weightless wonder that had captivated him since childhood. Yet Thomas could also feel the difference in himself, where once he had surrendered completely to the experience, now part of his awareness remained vigilant, scanning the periphery of his vision, tracking movements with a new alertness. It wasn't overwhelming or debilitating, but it was undeniably present, a new companion in his underwater explorations. They snorkeled for about 30 minutes, staying close together and in shallow water. Thomas took some photos, though more as therapy than serious photography, a way to reconnect with his professional identity and begin rebuilding confidence in his ability to work in this environment again. When they finally returned to shore, Thomas felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride at having overcome the significant hurdle of returning to the water, sadness at the loss of his previous untroubled relationship with the ocean, but also a tentative optimism about the possibility of forging a new connection that incorporated rather than denied his changed perspective. How was it? Sarah asked as they packed up their gear. Thomas considered the question carefully. Different, he finally replied, but still important. still part of who I am. In the weeks that followed, Thomas gradually expanded his water activities, always with a companion, slowly rebuilding his comfort level with the marine environment. He returned to Dr. Patel's office weekly, processing each new experience, acknowledging setbacks when they occurred, and celebrating progress when it came. 2 months after his first tentative return to the water, Thomas received an unexpected email from Dr. Matheson at the Monterey Bay Aquarium's Shark Research Program. "Thought you might be interested in this development," she wrote. "Our acoustic receivers picked up signals from Monterey Mary last week, approximately 200 miles south of her last known position. She appears to be following normal migratory patterns for female great whites in this region, moving toward the Southern California, Baja California area, where many females spend the winter months. We've attached the tracking data for your information." Thomas opened the attached file. Studying the plotting points that mapped the shark's journey down the California coast, there was something strangely comforting about knowing the animal was continuing its natural behaviors, following ancient, migratory instincts that long predated human presence in these waters. He composed a reply thanking Dr. Matheson for the update and asking to be kept informed of future tracking data if possible. It felt important somehow to maintain this connection, to know that both he and the shark were moving forward along their respective paths after their brief violent intersection. That weekend, Thomas returned to the cove for what had become a regular Saturday morning snorkeling session with Sarah. As they prepared their gear on the small beach, he noticed a family nearby, parents with 2 young children, perhaps 8 and 10 years old, all wearing wetsuits and preparing to enter the water. The older child, a girl with braided hair, watched Thomas with undisguised curiosity, her gaze eventually fixing on the visible portion of his scar that extended above the neckline of his wetsuit. "Excuse me," she said, approaching with the directness unique to children. "What happened to your neck? Did you get hurt?" "Sophia," her mother called, embarrassed. "That's not polite to ask." Thomas smiled reassuringly at the woman. "It's okay." He turned to the girl. "Yes, I did get hurt. I had an encounter with a shark while diving here a few months ago." The girl's eyes widened. "A real shark? Did it bite you?" "It did," Thomas confirmed. "I was taking pictures underwater, and it mistook me for something else." "Were you scared?" the girl asked, clearly fascinated rather than frightened by the story. "Very scared," Thomas admitted. "It was a great white shark about twice as long as this car." He gestured to his nearby vehicle. The girl's younger brother had joined them now, equally captivated by the story. "Did you fight it off? Like in the movies?" Thomas shook his head. "No, nothing like that. I was very lucky. Some park rangers came to help me and I got to a hospital in time. The shark swam away after it realized I wasn't what it was looking for." "Are you afraid to go back in the water now?" the girl asked, displaying a perceptiveness that surprised Thomas. He considered the question seriously. "I was for a while, sometimes I still am a little bit, but the ocean is important to me, so I'm learning to be careful while still doing what I love." The children's father had joined them now. "I'm sorry about the questions," he said to Thomas. "They're very curious." "No need to apologize," Thomas replied. "They're good questions, actually, if you're interested. There's a great exhibit about sharks at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. It explains how they behave in the wild and why attacks on humans are actually very, very rare." The father nodded appreciatively. "We were planning to visit later this week. We'll make sure to check it out." As the family moved away to continue their preparations, Sarah gave Thomas an approving look. "That was really good what you did there. Sharing your experience without scaring them, encouraging education instead of fear." Thomas hadn't thought about it in those terms, but he realized she was right. For the first time since the attack, he had used his experience to potentially shape someone else's understanding of sharks, not as mindless killers or movie monsters, but as wild predators deserving of respect rather than fear, creatures following instincts evolved over millions of years in an environment humans only visited. That evening, sitting on his small balcony, watching the sunset over distant Monterey Bay, Thomas reflected on the journey of the past few months. His body bore permanent marks of his encounter with the great white. 6 distinct scars that mapped the shape of the shark's jaw across his torso. But the less visible impacts were equally significant. A new relationship with fear, a deeper appreciation for life's fragility, a more nuanced understanding of what it meant to share the planet with wild creatures that operated according to rules humans had not written and could not control. He opened his laptop and navigated to the marine tracking application, checking the latest update on Monterey Mary. The acoustic receivers had logged her position again, now nearshore waters off San Diego, continuing her southern migration. Thomas studied the data points, imagining the massive predator moving through deep water, following ancient pathways, perhaps pregnant, and seeking the warmer waters where great white females often gave birth. In a few months, when the seasonal patterns shifted again, she might return to the central California coast, perhaps even to the waters off Monterey where their paths had crossed. By then, Thomas hoped to be freediving again, though he knew he would never do so alone again, would never approach his underwater work with the same carefree confidence he once had. Thomas closed the laptop and turned his gaze back to the darkening ocean horizon. The water out there remained what it had always been, not malevolent or benevolent, but simply itself, a world operating according to its own logic, its own imperatives. He had been granted the privilege of visiting that world for most of his life, and despite everything, he remained grateful for that privilege. The shark, too, was simply being what millions of years of evolution had shaped it to be, a supreme oceanic predator, perfectly adapted to its environment. Their encounter had been a rare intersection of different worlds, a moment when the modern human sphere overlapped with something ancient and unchanged since prehistoric times. As darkness settled over the bay, Thomas made a decision. The next day he would contact his regular clients, letting them know he was ready to accept limited underwater photography assignments again. The work would be different now, more carefully planned, always with safety protocols and diving partners, perhaps with a more nuanced perspective that acknowledged the ocean's dangers alongside its beauty. But he would return to the water, to the work that had defined his life for so long. The shark that had nearly killed him had swum away that October morning, continuing its ancient patterns, its life unaltered by their brief, violent encounter. Thomas would do the same, carrying the marks of that encounter certainly, but not defined or limited by them, moving forward along his own path, changed but not diminished by what had occurred in the silent waters of Monterey Bay.